thank you all for coming. So when I was trying to write this, I admittedly kind of stole his words, so it's plagiarized. This afternoon's speaker started his life as an only child in an Adirondack foothill farm. Each night he was put to bed in an upper room, while in the kitchen below the adults gathered around the table. The boy would slip out of bed and listen to the adults with his ear to the open register that was supposed to keep the bedroom warm. More than once he heard of a girl who drowned in a lake about 40 miles south. The accounts were mixed and unpleasant, and the adults went on to other subjects. Bored, the boy went back to bed. In 1956, he came to SUNY Cortland as a professor in geography. He learned that the story he had heard as a boy was not only true, but involved people from Cortland. Ever since then, he has continued to search for the true story behind what happened. In 1986, he published his first book on the topic, An Adirondack Tragedy, which we do have a copy of. It's the white one that he's holding there, which was then reprinted in 1998, which is also there. We have museum-only copies. You can come and read them. You cannot take them or buy them. And he's in the process of reprinting the book again due to high demand. Also, I think it was about last year, he published Cortland to the Adirondacks, which we have for sale, and as I said today, special $15. Over the years, I have had the pleasure of listening to Dr. Joseph Brownell expound on the topic of what happened to Grace Brown a number of times, including a meeting with descendants of the Gillette family, which happened right here in this very room. He's been featured in documentaries and television programs talking about this story. We are very grateful to him for again speaking to our members and friends. Dr. Brownell.
Thank you. Past and the present come together today. Where'd he go? There he is, right there. One of my first students in Cortland. Haven't seen him since, I don't know.
I left town shortly thereafter.
The other way, too. But it's interesting that you should be here because I almost certainly spent a lot of time in that earth science class on the Ice Age. Couldn't resist the Ice Age and what it's left of the top of the plateau we live on here. I usually find out, though, that not that many people are so interested in the Ice Age. If they're with me going sailing up the coast of Norway, they'd have me saying, there's a cirque, there's another, and another, and another. And they would be. There's a whole bunch of them there, but I don't want to get started on that. We don't call it the Brown case, we call it the Chester Gillette case. Partly because that was, of course, the name of the trial, the name of the case at the trial in Herkimer County. Partly because the Gillette family had owned the factory, they had more money, they were higher in the social order in Cortland. And on the other hand, the Brown family were relatively poor, farming on the top of a hill. And actually, the best soil is down near the Otisco River. Somebody had that probably, and he ended up leasing land on top of the hill. And that is what you're seeing in part here with the house and the farm, the barn, as they were probably 110 to 115 years ago. I've seen variations of this picture, and I don't know whether it's been doctored a little bit. I know I've doctored a little bit to get rid of some mess in the foreground, but I left the ruts. They look more functional that way. There is a dog of some sort there.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you've got it. Good. I was getting a worry. You might count the trees and see how many trees there are. I think I count 4.
Yeah.
If you stay long enough and I happen to get to the end of the line and show the current picture of the house, there should only be about 2 left. It's been 110 years since the criminal case against Chester Gillette was held. So let's get moving on and see what goes on. This is the less told story. It is the story of the Brown family, whatever became of them. By the time I got here in 1956, I wasn't paying attention. I didn't know anything about the Dreiser novel, for example, partly because I went to Syracuse University, and when I came to my advisor one day in registration, he said, "You have to take a course in English literature." Okay. What you going to do, American or British? I wasn't expecting that question at all. I had to make a snap decision and said British. And I ended up in the Lake District reading all that stuff. So I missed the one, An American Tragedy, which was the great American novel. I'm not judging it by using the word great. But it was the attention-getting novel, and it did get attention, which dealt with a previous event in history which actually occurred. I have to put it into the time context just a little bit, because when I was a little boy and listening to my uncles, I didn't hear half of what she said. My hearing isn't good, and don't repeat it. But I would ask my uncles, why are people talking about that sometime in the past? And this girl had drowned, and he said, well, that happened over in the Adirondacks. We're in the foothills on Route 3. And these people just remember that case. Well, they wrote a story about it, and that's what got their memory going. But I wanted to know, where'd this happen? Oh, about 40 miles down there. Down there happened to be to the south, which if I knew it at the time, and I didn't, is right over the border in Herkimer County, and there isn't a single highway between Herkimer County and St. Lawrence County. So it might as well have been 200 miles away. There's a remoteness to it, and if you're in Cortland and ask people, how many of you have been to South Otsay Lake? Your most answer, yes, how about that? There's some interest brewing there. Ask the first 100 people you see on Main Street, and they say, where? Because they're not likely to have been there. What may well have drawn you there is the fact that something did happen there historically. And I'm glad it did, because it makes a lot of collective interest. So let's move on here. We haven't gone anywhere yet, so let's move. Terry. There are 2 or 3 versions of this picture, more modern than this. If I get to them, I'll show them. Partly to see if the trees are still there. If they are they old? And in some of the pictures of the black and white variety like this, which look as if they were taken in about 1906, because that's what drew people to the driveway over there at the Browns' house when the Browns were in the newspaper all the while. Seemed like all the while. It was during the trial. I've seen this picture or something very close like it with a dog lying about where he is, but also at least 2 ducks, 1 chicken, and up on the platform near the back door, a cat, all minding their own business. But you don't always see the same picture. You don't know how often it's people just, they didn't do it the way we do today, take picture after picture after picture. They had film to buy. When you have the film to buy, you do it more slowly. You make judgments and say, gee, if I run out of film, I'm in trouble. Things have changed. Anyhow, a very quick scan of what caused all this, I keep referring to it, and you know what I'm talking about, is that there was a girl in the family that lived in this house. 11 people in the house, 2 parents and 9 children. And they were all born in the late 1800s, within about a 20-year span. So it seemed as if there was a child about every 2 years kicking around there. And when they got old enough, they got married and moved out. There was a regular progression. The one we're interested in, and we'll keep coming back to a lot, is Grace Brown, the middle child. 4 were older, 4 were younger of the 9. And Grace was born so that by 1906, when most of the events took place and she died, she was just about a flat 20 years old, having turned in the spring. In those days, what you did when you went to school was go to a one-room school. Some people in this room have done that. With the younger crowd, I can't usually find people who have even heard of a one-room school. But this one was the one I went to, and it had no running water. Well, there's no point in getting into that. We don't have the right picture for that. But no, this is okay. This is simply a picture taken at the end of the school year, a part of the school body, one-room school body. They're all girls, apparently, but there really were, cut out of the picture in the lower right-hand corner, 2 boys. This was very commonplace in the early summer when school was getting out, that the families called the boys back in to put them to work in the fields, especially if you're getting close to haying time in June. Takes about 40 minutes to drive over there, as I recall, depending on how you drive. But in those days of 1906, getting to South Otselic was not easy. There was one railroad that went from here to Cincinnatus, and that was it. That is going east-west. It crossed the G Brook Trestle over near Cincinnatus. And it seems to me they called it the Gee Whiz Railroad at some point in time. But once you got Cincinnatus, if you lived in South Otselic, it's either have a relative pick you up with a horse and buggy or walk. It's only 9 miles. People do make faces at that today, but when we grew up, some of us had to walk a little bit. I got interested in this, and I will start storytelling now. In about the 1970s, I'd been here now at least 10 years. And it was finally beginning to sink in that people kept talking occasionally, older people with good memories especially, that a death had occurred which involved Cortland people, or at least people who were currently living in Cortland. Grace Brown was one of them. She'd got a $6 a week job at the skirt factory, and also in the skirt factory was a relative of the owner, a nephew, and he had a reputation for hiring any relative. You'll find a job for him somewhere. And Chester Gillette came out of the Midwest, out of Chicago at that time. He'd been around quite a bit. He was 2 years older than Grace. The job he got was of the stock room, managing the stock room. By the stock for a skirt factory, it is mostly bolts of cloth. The girls would get an order coming on a piece of paper, the girls at the other side of the wall, and they were cutters. They'd have to go up and get the right amount of cloth, the right pattern, and things like that. And Chester would use his wits, I guess, to give them the right stuff, and then he made life miserable for some of them by hanging around the tables and talking. Chester wanted to be a social person. He wasn't a terribly good candidate, and that came to an end. So when Grace, as a cutter in the cutting room, and what they were doing, cutting cloth using patterns, cutting cloth around to get the pieces which would be sent on an elevator up to the second floor where the machines were, where the people using sewing machines, they sewed them all together and made the skirts. I have a blank page. I knew I had an intention of putting something on that blank page. It'll come out. The problem I had in becoming interested in this case in the 1970s was that there wasn't a great deal of, there weren't a great many Browns still living in the area. There were a number of cousins, some of them over in the Cortland, Homer area. And they were interested, but they were uninformed. What I really needed was somebody still alive, and already this family of 9 children were beginning to feel away. And I did get a line on 2 that had gone to Virginia, sent them letters. I thought they were rather well-built and sympathetic letters, even eager beaver letters. It was the wrong thing to do anyway. They didn't want to talk. And then I found out later on that there was one still living, didn't die until 1985. That was the youngest daughter of all, Ruby. She lived in De Ruyter, and she's buried there today. So Ruby was a possible source, but the word was out very quickly, she will not take visitors, she does not give interviews. Oh. The reason, by the way, behind this reluctance to give interviews was that this is an old traditional New England type family that moved to New York State, our part of New York State. And they had the general values of New Englanders, and what happened was that very quickly, the novel came out in the 1920s, was a success. Almost immediately after 5 years. By the time they had sound in movies, they made one of the first talkies out of the movie known as, by the same title as the book, An American Tragedy. And it is still available on DVD, by the way. It wasn't for years, but it is now. I got a copy somewhere. It rather exaggerated things. It exaggerated the poverty of the poor family. That would be Grace's family, in actuality. Not only did they exaggerate the degree of poverty, they made it a slushy, sloppy kind of poverty. Not very nice. And Mrs. Mrs. Brown over in South Otsilic, probably with some lawyer behind her, lay a lawsuit against Paramount Films. And that crushed a lot of people in the family who thought this was the dirty trick business, we don't want to be associated with it. So there was that hiding in the background. And it's one of the reasons that I couldn't seem to get to meet Mrs. Johnson, who Ruby married to Johnson. And I wanted to. So I got to know somebody. I don't, to this day, know how I got to know this woman in De Ruyter. I must have made a reference from a reference. And she was eager beaver. She's the widow of a banker there in that little town. And I went and we drank coffee all afternoon. I hate to admit this, but I don't like coffee. I'm Irish enough to have tea at the right time. Anyhow, I got her quite interested. She knew the story in general. I could fill in lots of cracks by now. And she was a good friend of Ruby. So I spent most of those coffee hours talking to her about how delicate the thing is, how easy it is to turn Ruby right straight around 180 degrees, and you don't want to do that. She agreed. She was very good. So she agreed what we should do is over a period of time. We've got all spring to do this now, let's say. Over a period of time, we'll work on Ruby very gently and quietly, not even mentioning the old days at first. And then maybe she'll introduce me. I'll have a chance to be on a first name basis, and I'll have it made. I drove home quite happy. Got in the door, the telephone was ringing. Guess who? My friend of coffee. She couldn't wait to get in the car and go over to Ruby's and tell her all about this, and blew everything. So that's why there's another blank page here. Then I did things the logical way. I was always very illogical in the beginning. Go search what you do have. Well, I don't have anything but obituary stories out of newspapers. Get them. I don't know who was telling me this, but they were right. I got the one more story up from at least one source, and it's typical of obituary stories in that they not only start with a survivor, if there's a survivor at that generation, but down to the children, like Clayton Brown of New Woodstock is their only son left. There was another, but not mentioned. The 6 daughters are Mrs. Julian Kraft of Smyrna, Mrs. Frances Preston of Syracuse, Mrs. Harold Landsman of Detroit, and so on. Well, it took a little while, but not too long, to figure out if I do a cross-off check here and cross off the ones of the 6 girls that are left. I think, and they say 6. I ought to get the one that is missing. I can account for most of the others. I can go to the DeRuyter Cemetery and find this one or that one. All the burials but one are either in South Otselic or in DeRuyter. So that compresses the problem and makes it a little easier to approach. It's got to be Mary. Now, one more and we'll go to the people again, even if the picture is small, we've gone too far. Can you go back one? There. This is a very small clipping, and it's a very difficult one. It's been reproduced over and over again. And in the back, to identify people, this is the teacher in the upper left in the doorway. She was a good friend of the family. I've got a place in here somewhere where I finally got talking with one of the Browns, and it describes her as a teacher, and that she slept around. You got to watch that one. In the old days when they didn't have much of a school budget, you think we got school budget problems today? Boy, in those days it was just a couple of $100, and where are we going to get it? And the teacher would be hired, as this lady was here, and she was probably a very good one. She had children of all sizes, from all grades, up either 1 through 6 or 1 through 5, I forget, or 1 through 7. And down in the bottom, you can just see the pictures of some heads in here are showing. And by the way, this is Grace right here, second person in height, but they're on steps, so you can't really compare the height. She was only 5'1" anyway. And this is her best friend, Fern. I think I sense between the two of them, though you don't have a terribly big picture to deal with, that Fern is a little better dressed up and a little more on the hairdo, which was very popular at the time. And Grace is a little more plain. And half of these other girls are younger sisters of Grace. She and Fern, those two, would sit together as long as they could. They watched the teacher like a hawk and commented in her diary. You'll see some of the diary coming up in a little bit if I have time here. The teacher had a boyfriend. I think I'd call him a fiancé. He was in medical school, such as they were at the time, and I think in Binghamton. But she got letters from him, and those two girls knew they were upfronters. They knew where the letter was coming from. They were watching her face to see what her reaction would be this time. You wouldn't think girls would do this in school, would you? Not much. Mary is the one, we'll come to her later. She's the one right there, the next in height, probably behind our middle girl. She looks as, they all look as if they're scowling. That's because they're out in the daylight. In those days, the film that you had used, that you bought, couldn't be used indoors, wouldn't be worth a darn. It wasn't sensitive enough. The film that you can get today is different. What film?
Yeah.
Today people are going in empty cameras doing things and they never unload them visibly. So anyhow, what this gave me was a clue as to who this person is. It says it's Mrs. Landesman. Landsman. I'm misspelling or going from the wrong spelling. So I had an idea in these days of the 1970s when there wasn't any internet, or if there was, I never heard of it. Because that's the first thing you'd want to do today to do a search is go to the internet. Not then. But I had a beautiful idea. I think a dozen other people would have had that much of an original idea way ahead of me. I knew the public library downtown, most of you do too probably. In those days, if you stood in the middle of the hall, may I call it a hall, the reading room, the big front rooms, and looked over at the desk, beyond the desk, behind the desk, is window number 1 and doorway. And right in between them, the primary color is yellow, just as yellow as those sheets of paper in front of you. Because they were all telephone books. The library had quite a collection of telephone books. I went and got Detroit. Thought I was being very clever. I'm glad it wasn't Brown that I was looking for. There would have been pages of them. But a name, what appears to be an odd name, like Landeman, should stand out if it's in there at all. I had searched the Detroit book. I couldn't find it. Not a one. So I put it back. And then on the way out the door, I remembered I have a daughter who lives in Bowling Green, Ohio. She's back in Cortland County now. Because of the Bowling Green connection, she's very close to Toledo. And Toledo is the junior city to Detroit. Don't tell people from Ohio that I use those terms. But it's a little like Rochester and Buffalo. Buffalo's bigger than Rochester, but some of the same. There's quite a bit of human moving back and forth between Toledo and Detroit. So I thought, I'll try the Toledo book. And I tried the Toledo book, and by George, there was one. Not Landsman, but Landesman. It's an extra syllable in there with the D-E in the middle. Not unusual to have misspellings in obituaries, by the way. But it was quite possible that this was a misspelling thing. And I wrote this letter, and now we can't, yeah, we are right there. To Mr. Aber Landesman. I think I was doing a little misspelling there. What I was doing was using the abbreviation I found in the telephone book. And there isn't any Aber. There is an Abe. His signature is cut in half, top to bottom. I see an Abe right here looking at me from the window over there, right behind the camera. That's our Abe Lincoln. It's usually short for Abraham. And Mr. Abraham Lansden answered my letter. Unlike the Browns that I'd been mailing things to, this one came right back. Actually, he just sent my own letter back. And on the bottom, he put it in the typewriter. He still used typewriters. And on the bottom, he put, dear Mr. Brownell, and Harold Landesman was my brother. And for any extra information, check with these two people who are his daughters, Betty and Marion. Betty in Detroit, but with a name changed, couldn't find the old name. And another one in Florida. Gee, that sounds good. So I could use just not right, but I could now use the information to approach either or both of those women. I was becoming terribly cautious about shaking people up and getting them running in the other direction. So I chose the one in Detroit because I know Detroit better than I know Florida. I sent a very guarded letter. I sent a guarded letter to Mr. Landesman. I don't want to shake him up if they're too, should I say, too brownish. I'm looking for browns, and now every generation I'm getting one step away a little bit, and that's more hope. And I sent the letter out to her, Betty, and got an answer right back, handwritten. And she gave me her phone number. This is getting better. I'm getting somewhere, I think. So I thought, I'll set up the phone, I'll set up with the tape recorder. And in those days, it was all right to tape as long as you asked the person on the other end, so they knew they were being taped. Bingo, she said, give me your address, or rather, give me your telephone number. Why? I want you to hang up, and then I'll call you. I want to talk about this. Oh, finally, a brown, she'll talk about it, and she did. And she mentioned lots of things, including her sister in Florida had a son. And the son, I can't remember his name right now, Bob, was up in the north, in New York State actually. Things were getting better. And she mentioned that, I didn't understand it at first, she had 2 stepdaughters. I don't think she had any natural daughters. But the stepdaughters weren't too interested in her life and her background. She was afraid if she could, and what happened here is that her mother, Mary, had been very close to our girl who drowned in the lake. They're very close together, only 2 years difference, I think, between them in age, and they were good friends. And Mary picked up, one way or another, little oddities, or little things anyway, like a diary. Not a diary covering the era we would like to have, but we'll take anything for starters. And she was very afraid that if she just leaves these things with her belongings in Detroit, someday those foster daughters or stepdaughters would take them away and they wouldn't value them for anything. So she sent them down to the son of her sister, a nephew. And he was teaching, at that time, television and radio in Brooklyn College. Oh boy, I've got to call him, and I did. I want to see him. He said, okay, come on down. Boy, I don't get invitations like that from the Browns. I'll take anything. And I did. I did make one mistake due to my inability to appreciate Brooklyn, because the only Brooklyn I've ever seen was going to Ebbets Field, all subway type stuff, or I lived in Brooklyn 2 weeks as a guest of the government when they called me back for the Navy. And there wasn't a place around which wasn't business district like, curbed. I don't want to park my car in a society like that. It isn't the society, it's the lack of the curb. So I flew down, took the subway, flew back, and took some things. And when I had met Bob, he was very helpful. And for example, he showed me the diary. It's only about this big. I saw it not long ago, and it's been battered to death ever since. I saw it in a fairly pristine condition, and I asked him, I had a camera with me, can I go to the bay window where the light is and take pictures of this? Sure. So I'm right over at the bay window like James Bond taking pictures. It worked. The quality wasn't good. We can go another step. See if I got up that far. More, wrong direction. Oh, this is just, there, no. There we are. quite a bit of stretch north and south on there. East and west is compressed somewhat. But the girl, this is our girl's handwriting when she was in about 1903. Somebody probably in the Christmas just before gave her a diary to fill in. So she did do it for 1 year. And it's nice to see that you can do lots of things like analyzing her handwriting. Right in there in the shadow is the capital I. I don't make my capital I's that way, but I have become a little bit of an expert on her handwriting, because people in the 1920s, one of the newspaper men in Syracuse gave somebody who would write like a woman. They used to say he had a woman's hand, and made it look as if it might have been the real thing, but it wasn't. But she does a good job of handwriting. If anybody who's seen mine will say she does a great job of handwriting. Look at the word for, how she makes a squiggle on the bottom below the line. You can't miss it when you see it. So if you're going to try and fake her handwriting, don't try and be Grace Brown. So this was the start of things like the diary. And then what I did with those 2 telephone calls, there were actually 2, is I later sat at the computer, not typewriter, and typed out the whole litany from beginning to end of what we said to each other. Now that's kind of disorganized. I say something and she, oh, I remember that, and goes changes the subject. And when 2 people get together on a common subject they both like, this tends to happen. You have to reorganize things or take out to abstract the things that are of very great interest. I've got to know how I'm doing on time.
12:47. 12:47.
12,
47.
45?
7.
47.
It tells you on the bottom of the,
Yeah, it's on the bottom of the screen.
I do that at home. Then I forget where it is. Let me pick out a few lines for this last 10 or 15 minutes. I wanted to know who Mary Brown, now we're into Mary, because Grace is gone. She died in 1906. Afterwards, Mary married somebody and moved to Detroit. Now, people in South Otselic doesn't usually go to Detroit. Anybody here from South Ot? Well, I'll make this change with you. I'm from Oswegatchie. That's a long way away. And we went into the Landesman business. I could ask Betty, who's no longer a Landesman, but tell me how she ever got into meet this guy anyway. And she said, well, yeah, he's the right one. You see, he's my father's only brother. My father's only brother. You see, my mother married a man who was Jewish. I found this wasn't so uncommon after all. I gave Bob all the things I had, even pertaining to my father's situation. My father was with the Quartermaster Corps during the war, First World War, and had letters from different people. I gave photos to Bob last time he was here along with other things. Now I'm on absolutely foreign territory. I almost said illegitimate, but I don't want to get into that. I gave Bob a photo. My father was a 32nd degree Mason, but of course, being Jewish, he couldn't go beyond 32. I know nothing about the Masons. Does that make any sense to anybody? Me either. That puts us all in the same boat, I think. My father traveled. This is Betty speaking again. He was an inspector at the mills, and he traveled, a government inspector during World War I, going to knitting mills and inspecting the quality of the output. And then he used to come home to my grandma's, who said, I'll bring that up in a minute. I want to finish with the father. My father died on Easter Sunday of a heart attack when Bob was just a little boy at sister's house. He'd gone to take them Easter baskets, and he died very suddenly. So there was quite a crossover here between Christianity and Judaism in a marriage that where nothing appears to have been particularly put down or caused any grief. If it was never mentioned. Then we get to one thing here. This is Mary's stone, and her Betty's buried right nearby. This is in virtually downtown Detroit. Had to ask a lot of questions to find where it was. Can we get back in any way back to that page from the diary? Right there. I don't know if you can read it with a lateral compression there, but try if you can. I think I have a translation here, if you don't mind my calling it that. Talk about dramatic. This is the day after her 16th birthday. 16 always seems to have been a big birthday for teenagers. I had one dramatic scene. I was ill all night. I fainted, underlined, fainted, for the first time in my life. The girl said I talked about JSB. She initializes a lot of pen pal's name. Did not go to school today. I opened my letter to Jim, that's JSB, and added 2 more pages. Papa didn't go to the village this morning. I wonder what JSB will think when he receives my letter. Well, I don't think he's going to worry about the 2 extra pages. I think it's the fainting session. Now, is this something she worked out as an event that is worth thinking about? A mark that she is actually progressing in age, getting older? I bring the question up. Any medical people here? You mean we're all in the same boat? During the trial, when Chester was up for her murder, Mrs. Gillette, Chester's mother, went to the governor and bringing a piece of new evidence. Her new evidence being that it was spoken of rather regularly in the cutting room where Grace worked at the factory, that she had, what should I call them, wipeouts?
Fainting spell.
Seizures.
Seizures.
Something, I don't know if they call it a seizure, but that's the impression you get. That backs up this business about what it started, because our society had a thing about epilepsy at the time. And the family refused to believe that there was any epilepsy in the family, because it was believed to be family oriented or family taken down the aisle. Didn't do any good for Chester anyway, but I asked Mary on the telephone about this, and she put it off in about 1 sentence and went on to something else. And she had worked for the Red Cross for years. She wasn't totally outside the medical picture. One last thing to bring up as a topic is that, and it's mentioned 1 or 2 times right here, Grace got out of South Otselic when she was 20 years old. Actually, she was 19, I think, 1905 when she came over here. Then she turned 20 in '06 in March or whatever the month was. But she didn't come alone. She had a favorite older sister, Ava. And Ava was especially liked by Grace because Ava always treated her like an adult. Nothing a teenager likes more than to not have these family people like parents saying, "If you wear your overcoat today?" and practically point at you with a question. Well, she used to visit, the year she had kept a diary, she kept the visits in Cincinnati, because that's where Ava and her husband were living. She loved it. And then she would make statements like coming home, meaning coming home to Cincinnati after they'd been somewhere. She liked to relish that business of independence, which she didn't have, and when you're in a family of 9 other children, you don't have a great deal of independence anyway, or you feel you don't, you may feel it. But then, Ava's husband got a job somewhere in Cortland. I don't to this day know exactly what it was. He was a cheesemaker in a cheese factory, so it may have been a dairy product business of some sort. Don't know. They went to Fifth Avenue, which if you're out of town, where our Fifth Avenue is 1 block long. But that's no news to anybody here, I don't think. And they lived at number 13. They had, by the time they came, Ava had a little boy. In fact, that fall, the first fall they were here, the only fall they were all here, fall of 1905. The little boy, Robert, suffered a problem. And it's hard to put the pinpoint right on where it all started anyway. Grace was there, so I think Grace not only took a $6 a week job at the factory, but she gave her a little cash. But Grace was also one who where am I? Back at the factory. But at home she could serve as a bit of a babysitter, we call it today, taking care of the little one who is now reaching toddler age. So he was born in Cincinnati a year or 2 earlier. More than just a toddler, he was maybe 2, but not more than that. And they had a problem in that he got carried around a lot. Grace carried him around a lot. And he had a tendency to play with and put in his mouth a curtain rod. Dangerous. Because a simple fall will cause scarring anywhere in the throat area. So knowing he had a throat problem, they brought him home for a weekend to South Otsilic and left him with the grandparents. And the grandparents called the doctor, and from that point on it was doctor-oriented. And I don't know to what extent, because they had no antibiotics in those days. There wasn't much you could do that wasn't surgical, and the local doctor, it may have been the father of the one who married the teacher. I don't know. They talk about, that is Mary talked about, there being a cut in the throat, and the doctor may have tried to clear the airway from the outside, I don't know. Wouldn't want me anywhere near a thing like that. Today we have ER to go to at least, if not take care of things like that. And in it, Betty continues, yes, right, now you mentioned that Grace had come home because of Robert. My grandmother was keeping Robert, Ada's little boy. I mean, he was playing horse and she was riding him around and she carried him around when she was visiting in Cortland. And he certainly had a curtain rod, and he stuck part of it down his throat. He became more and more ill those days, every day. and they didn't know what to do about it. Finally, there were no antibiotics. And of course, there never was any finger guilt at her, meaning Grace, because when Grace came, of course, they did tell her. But that's why there's a previous line that the grandparents have now told their children, which grandchildren, you can leave them with us, but don't leave us alone. And I can understand that one from a grandparent's point of view. Lastly, I love the way that Mary puts it. Remember, this is all the telephone, the two of us talking together, my wife listening around the kitchen, around the corner. We got off on some strange angles. She did some terrible things. I think we're speaking socially terrible here, not physically terrible. In those days, they didn't have sanitary napkins like they do now. But to throw my mother, she really means grandmother, off track, she brought home old dinner napkins from Wheeler's, where she stayed at the Wheeler house up here on Wheeler Avenue, number 7. They were washed and they were washable and they were cloth. I'm sorry, but back in those days, that's a delicate thing to speak up to anybody about, but she meaning Grace, was so clever that nobody in the family knew she was pregnant. And that 6 weeks she spent there. And that's a hard thing to cover up, not for most teenagers that wouldn't be thinking about it, but the mother, the grandmother age person might be wondering why there isn't more in the washing for that sterile wash that you do with scalding water. So Grace got away with a trick, and one thing is worth mentioning, she wrote lots of letters. I think the mother estimated that in the 6 weeks she was home, she wrote just 4 short of 40, which is quite a few, a full month's worth of letters. And some of her letters went to several pages. The famous one is 10 pages long, front and back on 5 sheets of paper. And Grace had going for her. I think we can probably close on this one. She was clever. I think I'd give her that too, but not only for that one trick. She had an intelligence service going. Yeah, thank you. Let's leave it on this one for the moment anyway. This is her stone this year, and people still keep it decorated every summer. And it's nice to see. She was 20 years old at the time. But while she was still at home on that 6 weeks of unpaid leave, she had 4 or 5 girls who were also cutters, who kept her deliciously in view of what Chester was doing when left alone. Because Chester didn't seem to give a darn about Grace, but Chester just loved having the attention of the other girls, or any other girl. He was beginning to find out he could talk to normal school girls and get away with it. He'd been around so much in the Pacific Northwest, and he'd even been to Hawaii. And in those days, nobody went to places like that. Sorry, Oregon, I didn't mean to say it quite that way. So what Chester would do would be to go out on a party on a Sunday, for example, with somebody, another girl, 2 girls, or 2 couples, possibly. Both were known. Both are on record because Grace's friends sent her letters with all this information. So then she knew what to file back to him and say, what were you doing this, and so forth. He didn't like it. He didn't like being held to task for things like that. So I think what we'll do now is, I know what I'll do, huh? It says 105. We've gone over. I think what I'll do is run the remaining pictures, as some people have to take a run. If you don't, you can just see the pictures for what they're worth. There's nothing particularly special, but if we keep going, oh, this one here, this is the cover of the new book when it's out. It is only an additional change. It's going to be a 4th edition. Some of the texts read the same. Many of the pictures will be the same. There's nothing new to be found there when you come looking for it. But when people look for Christmas presents and the like, and new friends and new grandchildren and whatnot, if you ever have this in mind, this looks like what we're going to use for a cover pattern. I don't know if it'd be quite that brown, but whatever it turns out to be. The timing should be about Thanksgiving, I am told. I wouldn't bet money on it, but I am told. We'll see. Now let's move on and just see if there's anything else worth seeing. This is like the picture of we saw earlier, but what it is really is one taken somewhere around the turn of the century, around the year 2000. As near as I can tell. Now there are only 2 trees left. But somebody's mowing the lawn. Go one more step and see what we find. There it is. Somebody owns it, and I think it's somebody in Staten Island. What the long-range plan is, I have no idea. Don't know the name or anything. But they're putting up an addition which looks as if it's a bunch of cubicles on the north side of the house. It doesn't have quite the same distinction that it had as an early farmhouse, but it's there. When I took the first picture in the 70s, 60s, 70s, toward the end of the century, nobody was living there. All the Browns were gone. Well, all the Browns are gone now, but who's going to be moving into this? Somebody even mentioned they thought there was going to be a bed and breakfast there. To make a good site if people knew where to find. And we'll put up a couple maps to show you how to get there if you haven't been there. Well, that's Billy's own signature. She was called Billy at home, Grace Brown. And she would write it out as things like this on the back of a notebook, for example. Okay. This is a rather large, small-scale map. Right in here, south of Silic, right that highway intersection, and that's Route 20, I keep forgetting, I don't need to do that. That's Route 26, the red line. This red line here that is north and south is the Cortland County line, up in the northeastern part of our county. So if you're looking for scale, down below here is Cincinnatus. So the quickest way to get there is probably go to Cincinnatus and make a left turn and go right up to 26. And then when you get to south of Silic, the farm is up in here somewhere. So go one more map. South of Silic is like this. You go a mile down the road and then up this road here. And I say up with a certain amount of respect because when Grace lived here, and you had to drive a team of horses or walk, if you were going to go from what is now Route 26 and go from there to the farm, it's, I think, 2.5 miles. A lot of winding road, but the trouble is the road tends to wind this way too. Up and down, but mostly the cumulative effect is to go up. Look at that, pull up the hill, for those who read contours, toward the end. If you get to the farm, you're 555 feet higher in altitude than you were when you left Route 26. Mm-hmm. That's exactly the height of the Washington Monument. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to do a lot of trudging by foot, but don't forget you're going to have to come back. Do the same route, sometimes going down. I have gone down the Washington Monument. That's hard on the legs too. So you get what you want. I think that's the last one. I'm not sure. Okay. So if you go over there, it takes about 40 minutes on dry pavement. But there are no speedways between here and South Hot Sea Lake. The people of South Hot Sea Lake used to call it the burg, the town. Nowadays I'm hearing South Hot quite often, and that's quite popular. As a community goes, it's closer to civilization, I think I would say, than Oswegatchie, New York is up there in St. Lawrence County. And I come from there. I'm not going back. I'm going to stay here. Thank you all very much for
May I ask you something?
Yes, any questions?
I'd like to know how many people here are of Brown or related to a Brown.
I was.
You should have come to rock and roll then.
Because my grandfather was a Brown.
Was he?
Yes. Yes. His name was Jim Brown, and his wife was named Jenny. She was a Fox. And my mother was an Ada Brown. And I had my cousin married a woman named Grace, or no, my uncle, and she was Grace Brown too. And I wondered if maybe, and my niece here, we were wondering if maybe some of my grandfather's relatives from way back a little bit might have been related to Grace Brown.
It's possible.
Yeah?
There are more Browns than there are Brownells. I say that in a joking fashion because literally there'll be telephone books with entire pages full of Browns who are not necessarily related. But when we get into places like this, you get into unique situations.
My mother was born in German, New York.
Where?
German. New York.
German over there.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people here know exactly where the South Hot Sea Lake Cemetery is. It's not on 26, you have to make that corner around. Maybe you could show people on
If
the
you go
map.
up 26 and you know you're coming close to South Hot Sea Lake, over on your right, there'll be, you sense you're coming to town, the clustering of buildings. But the road takes a little squiggle up the hill and to the right. But even before you get there, if you could look over beyond what looks like a little store these days, there are trees behind it, but if you don't take your eyes off the road. If you just keep long enough, there are little tombstones you can see in that cemetery, but to get there with the car, you go up into town, take the first right turn, and then take another right turn, and you'll get a gate going in. And it's got a great big family stone that says Brown. But that's over near the trees, as if you're going back to the highway again. Oh, is there something else popped up? I can't remember. It's probably just as well. It'd be foolish if I pull something out. I have worked some back in the Browns, but not. We were using the family tabs in the first edition, and I have very little beyond the parents. I think.
This is Esther Brown's.
In the telephone conversation with Mary, I think she was saying that, and I hope I'm not misinterpreting anything, that on the Browns, the mother's name was Minerva, that is the parents. Her mother, I think it was one of the pair of people who owned the building which became the, over in the college town, Colgate Inn. Whether that building still stands or has that name still, I don't know. One thing, if you want to get yourself, win a little money on a bet somebody that you can tell, that you know what the phone number was at the factory. Phones had just been installed when they rebuilt the factory. The phone number is easy to remember.
123.
One. His home on Cork Street 2. I think the 3 went to one of the Wickwires.
Yes.
So you get strange little quirks of these things as they come around. I never knew any of this existed when I first came to Cortland.
See?
Can I just give you a little story? I was in high school when the movie came out, A Place in the Sun, with Elizabeth Taylor,
And
Montgomery Clift.
Oh, was he
And
handsome?
when
Shelley
we found
Winters.
out it was
Shelley
based
Shelley
on
Winters.
something that happened in Cortland, why, we were just absolutely fascinated. And we went to the library and found the old newspapers to read about the
Oh,
trial.
yes,
Wow.
yes.
Yeah.
And something about the newspapers, I forgot what it was. People used to give me them in those early years when they knew I had an interest. Yellow newspapers that were yellow because they came off the bottom lining of a cupboard or something.
They were just stacked downstairs.
I still appreciate them.
Yeah.
Nowadays, you can do newspaper searches on the internet via newspapers.com, but they want money if you want anything worthwhile.
Easier said it's about 17 miles.
Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.